Okay, so what we've covered so far really is to try to develop what we call an evolutionary function analysis to our minds, right? So the way that I'm describing it to you may or may not stand the test of time, okay? So as the Buddha would say, don't accept this because I tell you. Make sure that it fits with the evidence and the data. Keep up with your scientific reading, Psychological Bulletin, all of the good journals. And we hope, that you'll keep an interest in general psychology. Like Eva was talking about her work with empathy. There's a big area of empathy research at the moment. So pull into your therapy basic science, really, because we're always surprised. Things we thought we knew, we discover we didn't. But anyway, so here's an understanding about emotions. Now, there are some individuals who talk about positive and negative emotions as if they're on a sort of, two different types of emotion. But in fact, one of the most important things that I discovered, I didn't discover it, I read it in somebody else, which was Richard Dupuis' work, was understanding the differences between the functions of positive emotions. They have different functions. And these functions are really quite important to understand when it comes to therapy, because positive emotions can have curative capacities. So the first positive emotion we're going to talk about is the emotion which is linked to joyfulness, excitement, and pleasure. And I would like you to imagine what would happen in your body, because a lot of compassion-focused stuff is body-rooted, if you won 100 million euros. Dollars. I'm in the wrong place. Sorry. $100 million. One of your big lotteries. Imagine you're worth $100 million. Is it Friday night? When's the lottery? Is it Friday night? Or Saturday night? You don't do the lottery? Oh, well. Okay, well, whatever night it is, imagine that you look at your numbers and they've come up. What would happen in your body? So many things, right? So you would have, again, sympathetic arousal. You'd become very excited. In fact, you'd have a mild hypermania. You would. You'd have racing thoughts. You'd have constant intrusions. You'd be trying to focus on writing your essay for your professor, but you wouldn't be able to think about that. $100 million. I've got to be writing about depression here. No, $100 million. So you wouldn't be able to focus your mind. You wouldn't sleep for a few days at least. Okay, you'd have a mild hypermania, you'd have a dopamine rush. And you'd find it very difficult, if at all, to override it. So the point is, not only when bad things happen, but when good things happen too, it takes control of your body, and then it can become quite difficult to override. And even if you'd been practicing mindfulness, I bet you'd have trouble holding your mind steady. $100 million. Oh, let's forget mindfulness, I think. Okay, so this is really important because it helps us understand. Now, the cognitive therapists always say, yes, but of course it depends on the meaning, because if you're already a billionaire, then of course it wouldn't be such a big thing. And one of my patients, who I naively said this to try to teach them about how our bodies often react to things very quickly, right? Said to me, oh, no, Dr. Gilbert, no, that'd be terrible. Oh, think of all the people who won't come and kill you for your money. And he was paranoid. So, assuming you're not paranoid, then you become hypermanic. All right, so this is very important. So it turns out that, again, we have heart rate increase, activation, pressure to act. Again, you will have narrowing of attention. So even the positive affect will narrow your attention. You keep focused on, you'll have intrusions, you'll be going back to anything like this. Imagine you're about to get married, or about to get your degree, or anything that's really nice, or you're going to see friends to a party that you're looking forward to, or you've got a holiday you've been planning for a while coming up. Your mind will keep going to that all the time. And this is important too because, as you saw in the video, the way in which we stimulate positive affect in the mind of our children and our babies is very important, because this links into the experience of positive affect in relationship. Okay, and most positive affect that you will enjoy in your life is in relationship. So if I said to you, look, you can have $100 million, but we're going to put you on a robot world, And this robot world will look after your every need. There are robot medics if you get sick. There are as much food as you want. There are boats in the lagoon that you can sail, but you'll never ever talk to another human being. You would give it up. No, but you can have a Ferrari. There are wonderful roads on this island. You can drive at 150 miles an hour as often as you want to. But you'll never ever see another human being. You give it up. So the key point is to understand that even in the context of all this material wealth and wonderful things, actually relationships turn out to be far more important. So that's important. Okay, so this is key then, is understanding that the way in which we experience relationships, particularly early in life, is very important. And what we know is, sadly, that mothers who are depressed or who have unresolved issues in themselves, particularly borderline mothers, this kind of interactional process is less likely. Okay, but it's right the way through there. See? And taking joy with each other. It's much nicer generally to go on holiday with people that you know and you like than people that you don't know or don't like. So that's important. So let's think about this system, because this is a system which is very interesting as well. Oh, I should just point out actually that for children who don't get stimulated, they're looked after, but they're not stimulated emotionally. They're often left on their own. You have this kind of lack of brain development. Now, this is taken from Bruce Perry's work on the Romanian children. There you are, you've got the reference for it there. And so again, the key story I want to tell you over and over and over again is that your brain is the most evolved brain to respond to social signals. Social signals are absolutely the nutrients, particularly positive social signals, for your brain. And this needs to be much better built into our therapies, I think. So let's think about the green system. Now, the green system really is a different type of positive emotion altogether. This isn't the emotion of hypermania, excitement, dopamine buzz, and all of that, which is important, nothing wrong with that. It's not activation, it's behavioral activation of doing and achieving, though that's good. I'm not saying there's anything bad about that. But this is the capacity for feeling soothed, to feel at peace, to feel content. Okay? So contentment then is this sort of just pleasant smile. I'm happy. I'm at peace. Okay. And what we know is that the capacity for soothing, for being at peace, evolved within the attachment system. Because these little chappies, when they hatch out of their eggs, they have to run like hell to the water to escape, and only about 1 or 2% of them will make it to come back and reproduce. If more made it, then the beaches would become overcrowded, obviously, very quickly. So this is a very, very high mortality rate, okay? So as my Buddhist friends often say to me, you've got to be good, Paul, otherwise you'll be back as a turtle. At least it will be short, I hope. Anyway, so there we are. But then comes attachment, and oh boy, does this make a huge difference, because now this is the beginning of the capacity for one mind to have a major impact on the mind and the body of another. So here we have not only the capacity for protection, but in the context of protection, the baby is safe. And when the baby is safe, there is no threat. And also the mother is looking after all the baby's needs, so there's no seeking, there's no drive. And in this state, there is the state of contentment. So the state of contentment and soothing is very important. And what we know is that this capacity for calming and soothing in relationships is built into your brain. This relationship is partly linked to oxytocin, but only partly. And there are oxytocin receptors in your brain. Oxytocin turns out to be a little complicated hormone, though, because it can also make the mother much more aggressive to anyone that threatens her baby. So it's not all lovey-dovey stuff. But that's another story. Now, the key thing is then, for you too, if you are distressed or upset in any way, what do? Do you take out a thought form and start to look at your thoughts? Okay, I'm feeling upset, I better see what I'm thinking here. The chances are you don't. The chances are what you'll do is you'll go to your mobile phone or whatever, and you'll talk to somebody who you feel cares about you. The first thing you'll want to do is to turn to somebody you think has empathy for you or cares about you. Oh my God, I was telling you what happened the other day. This person was so unkind to me. And then what you want for them is to, oh my God, you poor soul. Oh, that sounds terrible. Oh, how did you cope with that, right? So getting this validation, getting this capacity to hear another mind, sharing in your distress, and clearly having concern for you, that calms you down. Okay? Your brain is basically a social stimulator and analyzer. And the reason for that is because so much of your evolutionary journey through life is going to be dependent upon the kinds of relationships you have with others. So there we go then. That's how it's evolved. So caring then is about looking after, but it also has this soothing, calming ability. And this soothing, calming ability in the context of another is very important. And we also know that cooperative and mutually supportive relationships also have a calming impact when you're doing things together. And that means that loneliness becomes really quite important for understanding how people regulate emotion. Now, I see this as extremely important because there's a story I often tell, which is the fact that my father was a Spitfire mechanic. He used to look after the engines, Spitfire engines. He was a really young man, 21, 22, whatever it was. And he would tell the stories about how, particularly during the Battle of Britain, the young guys would come down, they'd land, and they'd be told they were being stepped down. And so they'd be stepped down, and they'd go and get something to eat or have a drink or whatever it is. And then they'd get scrambled again when they weren't expecting it. So off they'd go again. And sometimes the cockpits would come back covered in vomit and diarrhea and stuff because these guys are absolutely terrified. You know, they'd see their friends shot out of the sky, and sometimes it wasn't common, but occasionally the German pilots would shoot the parachutes so they were going down, and it was just horrible thing. So, but the interesting point was, as he pointed out, and this was true for American bombers who were in England as well, they were taking very high casualties at night, but they went night after night after night. How can you do stuff that's that terrifying? You do it because you're part of a group, because other people are depending upon you, because other people are sharing in your terror. But if you have panic disorder or you're depressed, it's only you. You're alone, and your fear doesn't mean anything to anybody other than you're a bit neurotic. It's a very different experience, right? So this is really, really important to understand that often when a lot of our patients experience their difficulties, people with psychosis experience their difficulties, they have an enormous sense of aloneness. And part of this aloneness is often linked to the way in which emotions are linked together. Now, emotions that fire together wire together in the same ways that neurons that fire together wire together, Donald Hebb's famous thing. So, for example, imagine then that a child is punished or hit or abused and sent to their room. Now, when a child is threatened and in a state of distress, the one thing that they need more than anything else is a soothing object to calm them down. Because that is what they're biologically designed to be calmed by. But that isn't going to happen because they've been sent to their room and they're on their own, or their father, whoever, abuses them and then leaves them on their own. Now, the experience of aloneness is very, very core to a lot of our patients, and they would tell you these kinds of experiences, how they were pushed away, sent to their rooms, whatever it is. And so what happens is you have high levels of fear associated with this sense that there is no one there. You are alone. No one comes. Okay? You talk to abuse cases, no one comes. No one comes. No one comes for you. Okay? But that sense of aloneness gets built in by classical conditioning, emotional memory, into the experience of fear. And this is often common that when people begin to get frightened or depressed, there's this dreadful capacity for the sense of aloneness. And that's why we often go after the green system in terms of therapy. So there we are. So when we engage with soothing, okay, we have a calm, and it's to do with slowing. And when we do the breathing exercises, we're going to be talking a lot about slowing. So the other three emotions we've looked at, the positive one of excitement and joyfulness, the one of anxiety and the one of anger, they're all sympathetic, but this one is parasympathetic, and it has a calming quality to it. And what happens is your attention becomes much more open and explorative, okay? Now, for those of you who are mindfulness practitioners, you're beginning to think, oh, I know, mindfulness helps to activate the system, and in fact, it does. It produces a much more parasympathetic kind of arousal pattern. And so you enter this sort of peaceful, calm state. Okay. Won't worry too much about that. So just move on quite quickly. So the ability to respond to distress, right, and to be calmed by the response of others. Remember, in evolutionary theory, you've got to understand the signal and the reception of the signal, because there's no point in sending the signal if there's nothing in the other person to receive it and respond to it. Equally, if you're distressed and you send signals of distress, but there's no one to answer those signals, that does harm. Okay, so the functions of caring then are protection, okay, distress core responsiveness, so being there when in need, the provision, obviously, the parent provides, and affection. What we now know is affection, particularly physical affection, has very major impacts on the maturation of the brain. Even rats, laboratory rats, who are regularly handled and stroked, these rats grow up to be calmer than those who grow up in isolation. Education and validation is a very important provision for the parent to the child, of course, and there's a whole area of that we could talk about. And that the parent provides a source of interaction, brain stimulation through curiosity, play, and so on. So the basic story is this then, in terms of compassion-focused therapy, that simplifying it down, you have a threat system which has evolved to be regulated through this system. It's not the only regulator, of course. Mastery, self-efficacy, a whole lot of other things, learning skills, all of those things remain crucially important. But this is an element too, which is the ability to be calmed down in the context of affiliative emotion. So if that happens for you when you're growing up, that others are calming, they're helpful, you turn to them when you're distressed, then you will develop internal representations of them, you will lay down emotional memories, you'll lay down neurophysiological systems because these will be stimulated, and you develop a sense of yourself as lovable. Because people tell you, they put you on their knee and they say, you are lovable. Okay? We love you, my son. Okay? And this allows you to learn to regulate your threat by turning to others. It allows you to become safe and open and exploring the minds of others, develop what we call social intelligence. It helps you develop empathizing and mentalizing skills. And of course, it also supports pro-social behavior. And again, this is not my work at all. This is all the work of Nancy Eisenberg and lots of other people who have been studying pro-social behavior. What is it that facilitates pro-social behavior? Basically, it's when children have experienced safeness and caring in their lives. This is what stimulates pro-social behavior. On the other hand, if your parents are alarming to you, frightening to you, okay, or unpredictable to you, then that isn't going to stimulate the soothing system. So it doesn't get stimulated. It's a red arrow. You don't get any emotional memories. You don't develop the neurophysiological regulators, and you certainly don't develop a belief and a feeling of yourself as lovable, but rather as unlovable. So that's the problem that we have with some of our people that we're trying to help. And this is different from the cognitive model because we're much more into the affect model and the emotional memory model, okay? Emotional memories are crucial. So that's how it works. I'll give you one story, actually, which might help you with this. A story which we could give this afternoon, but it's useful to give now. This is of a patient who was quite a high-profile person in England. Who I get to see some of these sort of patients. They get sent to me. Who's wanting to hang himself. So he carried a rope in his car and he kept looking for a good tree and that sort of thing. He was into that kind of behavior. Anyway, so the story was that when he was a young guy of 3 years old, he was very poor and he was in this, they had a 2-roomed house or a 3-room house, and his brother was 18 months and they slept in the same room. And one day his brother was taken quite ill, and so they called the doctor, and the doctor came out and said, yeah, it's probably an infection. He'll be fine. I come back and see him in the morning. So 6 o'clock, the child is struggling breathing, phoned the doctor again. The doctor had just gone off call or whatever it was, and nobody came, and so the child an hour later was dead. So this was a terrible tragedy. The mother obviously became very angry, fell to pieces, got depressed, was hospitalized with depression and all kinds of stuff. So that's the background story to this chap, right? So his affiliative system was all over the place, and he'd become a very high-profile doctor, but was very autocratic and felt that everybody else was useless apart from him, and he had to do it all. You can understand why. So there we are. But he'd got to the point in his life when he just couldn't do it anymore, and he felt that he'd failed and all that. So we were doing what we call compassionate image, just trying to help him imagine that there would be what it would be like to imagine a really compassionate being who was there to help him and care for him and support him. And when he started to do this exercise, he said, no, I don't want to do any of that. He said, that's rubbish. I don't want to be imagining having helpful people around me. Why do I want to do that? So it's quite contemptuous. So I said, well, we're going to try and stimulate parts of your brain. Let's see what we can do, blah, blah, blah. Anyway, and eventually he said, okay, I'll have a go. So he sat in the chair, and we did the breathing, as we'll do this afternoon, and we did the focusing, which I'll teach you this afternoon. So he had to then imagine this really kind, caring being who was wanting to help him with his depression and understood how awful it is to be depressed. So he started the exercise and said, well, I don't like this at all. This is awful. I don't want to do this. So we said, okay, let's just stay with it. And doing the cognitive thing, we obviously do the experiment. So what is happening in your mind? Just wind the video. Let's see what's going on. Can you explain your feelings to me? So he said, well, it just goes so dark, I'm trying to imagine this being, but, when I'm trying to imagine this kind being, absolutely nothing comes. In fact, I just feel more and more dark. I feel surrounded in darkness. Okay, so what is that darkness like? Oh, so it's cold. It's like being in outer space and there's absolutely nowhere around, nothing around. So I said to him, okay, so if you wanted your compassionate being to be there with you right now, what would it do? What would you want it to do? And there was this silence. And then a tear rolled down his cheek. And he said, put the light on. And he looked at me through these, crying quite profoundly. I said, I've just remembered, my mother told me that when my brother died, I used to cry a lot. I didn't like to go in the room, But we were poor, there was nowhere else for me to sleep, right? And, but she said to me, I couldn't go in that room either. And so we used to just leave you to cry, and eventually you cry yourself to sleep. So the point is, the attachment system was completely blocked up. So when you begin to open it by actually thinking about or imagining a caring, kind, parent-like coming to help you, what we ran into was an emotional memory of crying in the night, crying in the night, crying in the night, and all there was darkness and emptiness. That's what we were running into time and time again. So this system was completely blocked up. The emotional memories in the system were of actually no one comes, right? So when we started to do the exercise of imagining someone coming, imagining a kind, wise being there for you, what we ran into was the emotional memory in the system. Now that's no different from classical conditioning of imagining a holiday, lovely, but then something really bad happens and you bring the holiday to mind and you get horrible memories, not nice ones. So the important thing is recognizing that this system can get really blocked up and doesn't work very well. And in compassion focused therapy, that's a serious problem because you're actually losing one of your main affect regulating systems. And what often happens then is that people then, they get stuck like this. Big threat, little soothing, or they do this. And this is a very classic that we see in patients all the time. But this is an eating disorder example where this individual has a lot of fear and anxiety about all kinds of stuff, fear of being rejected. These are quite sensitive souls, these people. They're a little bit alexithymic and they have all kinds of perfectionistic issues. But what they discover is that if they go into the drive, if they achieve things, if they do things, they have a sense of pride, then they don't feel so frightened anymore. So they get on the scales, they've lost a pound, or in your country, a kilo. Is that right? Kilo, it's kilo, isn't it? So lost a kilo. Okay, so maybe it's a kilo and a half. And that gives them a good feeling. If they put on weight, then they go back to feeling shame. And they start bouncing. Okay, now this is the slight problem I have with certain activation psychologies. It teaches people to do things and achieve things, and that's great, okay. But you've got to watch it, because if that becomes the way in which they're regulating the threat system, then the moment that they start to fail, they're right back here again. Okay, so achievement is okay, that's important. But what we find is, for these patients who are caught up in this loop, is they cannot get over here. They do not know how to get over here. So one of the things that's really important in the therapy is that you always go this way around. Okay? So when people, they need to go that way and then they're often to drive. That way often to drive. If they go that way around, okay, it's usually unstable. And particularly when they come over here to solve this problem, they become very critical when they start failing. They become pushy, pushy, pushy. Whereas if they learn that when you fail, you actually learn to be kind, supportive, and encouraging, that gets you back on the horse, and then you can get back into achieving whatever you want. That's important. So what happens is we look at the way in which we get blocks into these systems, but that's to take you more into the technical elements of the therapy. So here's a typical example of how we would think about depression. What happens in depression is we have elevated threat, and this can be the result of long-term of anxiety or worry or difficulties in life, whatever it is. And in some depressions, particularly the anhedonic depressions, we get a collapse in this system. It just kind of collapses, and then people can't generate any juice in the system, so they feel dead, they've got no energy, they have despair. But if there's a collapse in this system, then the emotions that they will talk to you about are feeling separated, alone, disconnected, nobody understands, you can't feel socially safe, you want to hide away. And so understanding that means that you might have to have different therapies for that, and for that. And in our view, this one is underrepresented. So we've got therapies for these two, but this one is a really important one to go for. Okay, now I'll just talk a little bit, because Yotam asked me to mention this to you. The other thing where this is important is in things like combat trauma. Now we're doing a little bit of work with colleagues. It's not me directly, but with colleagues. And one of the problems that people coming back from combat have is fitting back into their routines with their families and so on. And it can be quite difficult in the context of a media that's very keen on films like MASH and all that. Now, I love MASH. It was a fantastic series and movie. I love it. But there is a story implicit in MASH that when you go home, everything is fine. Okay? But actually, you have to be cautious about this, because the affiliative system, the system that makes you feel safe, becomes very much linked to a male buddy system. So that all the threats around you, the people that are going to protect you, calm you, and help you are your male buddies, okay? And that is what gives you your sense of connectedness. And in fact, armies actually build on that so that you become very protective of your unit. So your affiliative system, when you come home, is not now entrained towards safe environments. You're entrained towards threatening ones. You're certainly not entrained towards parent and child relating. You have a loss of feeling of safeness because your buddies aren't around anymore. So that's, And so one of the things of simply talking to people using the three-circle system of why this is happening, it is not your fault, but it's because your affiliative system is retrained for that environment, and it's going to take a while for it to retrain to this environment. Just those very simple things to take off the issue of emptiness and self-blame can be very important. And that's why sometimes when the veterans get together and they can talk to each other, they can reactivate that system again. So again, just using the three-circle systems, helping people and say it's absolutely not your fault, it makes perfect sense, there's nothing wrong with you. It's the fact that your soothing system is trained to a particular environment, and it's going to take a while for your brain literally to retrain itself. So let's just see what we can do to help you in the meantime. So the fact that you're not in love with your wife anymore, or you don't feel stuff for your wife anymore, or you're still waking up frightened, this is unfortunate, but it's not your fault. Comes back time and again. And again, loneliness is very important. The most common experience of many clients is in a sense of loneliness, and that means that your affiliative system is not available. The most common reason that people seek religion is to find a way of breaking through the feeling of being alone. You talk to many people who are seeking religion, that's what they want. They want to feel loved. They want to feel connected. Feelings of loneliness are highly associated with other emotions. The loneliness makes the threat emotions very difficult to work with, and therefore we are particularly focused on loneliness. And this is a wonderful book by Capiopo, I think that's how you pronounce the name, and Patrick on loneliness. So we're increasingly interested in the issue of loneliness that sits behind people's problems. Okay, so the next thing then we need to be thinking about is, of course, so that's all the background, right? Now remember, this is a one-day workshop, so we're just touching on a few things. The actual compassion-focused therapy you'll have to go to Yotam for, because there's quite a lot of stuff underneath this. But that's given you a flavor of the three circles. It's given you a flavor of how we can think about things, and it's given you a flavor of how we contextualize that within an emotional model. Okay, so I think we're planning to stop lunch for 12 o'clock, so I'm going to get through this quite quickly so that we can move to our exercises this afternoon. Okay, so just to remind you that compassion-focused therapy is about a mentality. You can't understand it simply as being something stuck in your own head. You have to understand it as an interactional process. There's no point in you understanding how caring and wonderful you are if you don't understand how open you are to being cared for. Okay? So we need to think that compassion has evolved from a caregiving, what we call social mentality. Remember, social mentality means that the motivational system is dependent upon the interactional cues. Compassion is showing that we care, of course. And the Buddhist monk Jinpi, really, who's done a fantastic job in compassion cultivation training here, defines compassion in terms of four key components: an awareness of suffering, a sympathetic concern, a wish to relieve that suffering, and a responsiveness or readiness to help relieve that suffering. So he sees it this way. The way in which we work with suffering is a little bit different, but it's pretty much similar. And we call it the two psychologies of compassion. And this is taken from a fairly standard Buddhist approach, but also, as Dr. Calvin was mentioning before, from Leviticus, thou shalt not stand by while thy neighbor bleeds. There are many, many forms of compassion, many traditions of compassion, and Jinpi was making this point at a conference earlier, that actually more or less see compassion in the same way. The one thing you don't do is confuse compassion with love, particularly love is used in the Western lexicon, the word love, okay? So compassion is a sensitivity to suffering of self and others with a deep commitment to try to relieve and prevent it. So that's our definition, right? And we give that to patients. If you're working with aggressive males, very aggressive males, and you're talking about compassion, the first thing you do, right, one of the things you do is say to them, what does compassion mean to you? What does that word mean to you? And then they say, oh, it's kindness, it's softness, it's love. And then we say, so what don't you like about it? And they say, well, I think it's soft, I think it's weak, and I think, see? So you start there. What don't you like about your own definition of compassion, okay? And then you say, I agree, I think that's a shit going about the world. Okay, what about if we give you this definition of compassion? What about this one? What do you think about this one? And what about if you absolutely needed your courage at your best to be able to do this, right? This ain't about being soft. This is can you pay attention to pain? Can you? Can you do something about it? Would you be prepared to do that? What about the person who rushes into the house to save the baby, right? Who's the burning house, I should say. Not just any old house. The burning house to save the baby. What about 9/11? Is this compassionate behavior? Well, of course it is. So it's great to go meditating and being mindful and everything, but not if you run the opposite direction. Compassion has to be this commitment, okay? It's not just seeing it, but having a commitment. And probably many of you remember Live Aid or Band Aid. Some of you may remember, some of the older generation. And this was a guy called Bob Geldof, who was a pop star with Midge Ure, who was also a pop star. And they brought together this fantastic concert right around the world. We had places in New York and I think in California too, and in England, in London, Hyde Park, big pop concert to raise money, and they raised $100 million. And Bob Geldof's emotion wasn't emotion of all of this. Bob's Geldof's emotion was anger. This should not be happening, right? We should not be letting all of these people die in Ethiopia of famine when we can do so much. It's not right. And he was he wasn't a mindful guy, but that's compassion in action, right? And there was a famous, it's on the YouTube, you can see it, a very famous point where the concert's going on and there's Queen and all the big bands playing, Led Zeppelin and everything. And then they switch back to the people in the studio and they're saying, come on, these are the numbers you need to call in, we need your money, we need your money. And Bob Geldof looks at the camera and says, come on, there are people starving, give me your fucking money. And the BBC went, oh my God, he's wrong on the BBC, oh no. So there is a real discussion to be had about these two psychologies, right? Now, of course, the point about it is that anger is what is called unskillful, okay? Because if you just let anger run the show, then it can become unskillful and you end up being more damaging than the damage you're trying to do something about. But the key thing is that if you have compassion as motivation, right, then we don't quite know what the emotions are that are the first emotions, just the sense that I don't want this suffering to continue, right? And so while it is also true that we hold suffering in this compassionate wish, actually is also the commitment to try to leave it. And the Dalai Lama talks about this, the commitment. It's not just a wish, oh, I wish it could go away, wouldn't that be nice? It's the commitment. How do you dedicate yourself to this? Now, there's also, of course, the bodhisattva issue. So the two psychologies there are the psychology to approach, to understand, and how to engage with suffering, how to pay attention to it, but also how to work, prevent, and alleviate if you can. And sometimes, of course, you can't. If somebody's dying, the only thing you may do is to hold their hand and try to help them not feel so alone when they die. But each of these psychologies are, in fact, quite complicated. So caring then has a concern for the other's distress. It has this wish for others to be free from the suffering, of course. It has an interest in the welfare of others. It's not just suffering. It has an interest in being happy. Remember you saw the example of the children helping out. Okay? And then I feel happy if I can help you feel happy. And it's the motivation and wish that others can grow and flourish. So it's not just the desire to remove suffering, but it's also the well-being, the wish that you can grow, that you can become enlightened, that you can find the way. So the bodhisattva desire, motivation, is to help people become enlightened themselves. Okay, so I took, in the 80s, this is where I got my idea of compassion from. I took it from Alan Fogle's work on Nurturance, just to, show my sources. And they had a wonderful definition, which of course is very psychological, that nobody understands, but it's great. And this is the provision of guidance, protection, and care for the purpose of fostering developmental change congruent with the expected potential for change of the object of nurturance. Okay, now actually, if you sit and read it, it makes perfect sense. But the key thing is what they said was that caring is based on an awareness, it's based on a motivation, it's based on an understanding, it's based on an expression, and it's based on actually changing your behavior according to how things are going. So that's where I got all my stuff from. That was where I began with compassion. I began with these people's research. It wasn't my ideas. It was all basically in the psychological literature. Okay, anybody could have done what I've done. It's all in the literature. And so, as we've seen then, actually caring can begin in childhood. Children take an interest in caring for others. We know, Eva would talk to this better than me, empathy begins in childhood and it matures in certain ways. And also we see that caring is shown in play behavior. And play behavior is very interesting because it can sometimes offer a reflection about what's happening at home. So if you look at, say, for example, girls who play with toys or how they interact with siblings, how they play with siblings, you'll find that girls who are in secure backgrounds will tend to have their dolls and they will be focusing on having a cup of tea or time for tea, cup of tea, give me water. Because we drink tea, we coffee in England and America, we have a cup of coffee. Time to go to bed. Whereas children who are coming from more aggressive backgrounds, they actually play out those with their dolls. Oh, you naughty doll, I'm going to smack your bottom. So the play behavior then often is a reflection about how the child is learning to interact with a doll when the doll is was a representation of, say, like a baby or whatever. You also know that children have preferences to play with caring toys. So if you show a child, very young child, and even a year old, a teddy bear that's helping another teddy bear up a slope, whereas a different teddy bear is pushing the teddy bear down the slope, they always prefer to play with the caring one. And this requires empathy and mentalizing at quite a young age. So helping then is attuning to other people's goals. It's altruistic, is helping at the possible expense of oneself. It requires empathy and mentalizing, and it begins in early childhood. So let's now look at these qualities. And as I say, we're coming to the end of the morning, so you'll be delighted to hear we're coming to the end of all of the complex stuff. So the engagement. What do you need to engage? Okay. Well, firstly is motivation, okay, in our system. There needs to be a concern for caring. Now, the compassion circles are on the 3 domains. So you can use these in terms of how you relate to other people. You can use these until how you experience other people relating to you. And you can also see this as part of self-compassion. So it can be motivation, the care for well-being. It can be your care for other people, how you're motivated. It can be how you sense other people being caring of you. And it can also be your motivation to be nurturant and caring of yourself. So all of the qualities have the 3 domains, right? So the next one is assuming that you are interested in being caring. And of course, there are also often quite a lot of blocks to that. People say, no, I don't want to be caring. Who wants to be caring? I'm too angry or whatever. So you work with that. Then we pay attention. So sensitivity. Okay, remember the definition, sensitivity. But if we're going to be sensitive, then we're going to be emotionally moved. Now, there's a lot of discussions about empathy and sympathy and lots of different definitions. And Bateson wrote a really good paper in Decky's book on this. What was it? The neuropsychology of empathy, I think it was called, wasn't it? James Decky. Yeah. Yeah. So this is our take on it, right? But you can read other people's. The neuroscientists have got other takes. We come from a therapeutic background going back to Rogers, so we've just stayed absolutely true to that tradition. Some of the neuroscientists have got other things like emotional empathy and cognitive empathy, which we think, as therapists, that's a bit confusing. So sympathy really is your automatic, immediate responses, okay? It's a non-cognitive system, this sympathy. And this is the one that's linked to the mirror neuron stuff. So if you go to the movies and you see a sad scene and you're crying, you're kind of tuning in to this process. It's an automatic kind of process. And we can see this also in animals to a degree. But if you're going to be emotionally moved by what you're attentive to, then you're going to have to have distress tolerance. So imagine you're working with a trauma person, and the person says to you, yeah, I want to be caring of my suffering, and one of the problems I need to work with is my memories, because I have a lot of trauma memories. And you say, okay, well, let's just talk about that. So they say, okay, well, Dad used to come home on a Friday night very drunk, and then we got beaten and stuff like that. But then it was like that for all the kids, and I wasn't the only one. There were many fathers who were doing that. Now, Freud would call that decathected memory. What it means is that you have the memory, but there's not much emotion there, really. Okay? And so part of the issue is helping the person begin to experience the emotion. If you're going to work with the memory, you have to change the emotion in the memory. And if they're absolutely split off from it, then it's difficult to do. So gradually the person may start to remember just how horrible and frightened they were and begin to work with those memories. And that can be quite moving. So that's important. You are emotionally moved. It's in your body, this one. Okay, you feel it in the body. But then you have to be able to tolerate that distress. And there are various ways in which we can help people learn how to tolerate the stress. One of the reasons people dissociate from trauma and memories is because they can't tolerate it. It overwhelms them. It's too horrible. So we have to teach people distress tolerance skills, and that might be safe place, or actually just being very gradual in exposure. And then, of course, we have empathy, which is linked to mentalizing in our model, which is the ability to make sense of it all, right? Okay, theory of mind is where you actually understand the process of what it is to have a mind. The classic example of theory of mind is that if I have two glasses here, okay, I've got two children down there, Sam and Judy, and I say to Sam, Sam, would you go out of the room for a moment? And I say to Judy, look, Judy, there's a sweet in this cup which Sam knows about. I'm going to take this sweet out, I'm going to put it in that cup. Okay? Where will Sam look for the cup when he comes back in? Now, if Judy's got theory of mind, she'll know that he doesn't know that I have moved the cup. In other words, she knows that she has information that he can't have. So she'll be able to think from his perspective. If she doesn't have theory of mind, she has problems with autism or whatever, she'll say, oh, here, look in this cup. And she'll look whether, because she won't be able to take that perspective. So this is an example of being, perspective taking is an incredibly important thing. And empathy is this ability to, on purpose, train our minds to become empathic. So there's an intuitive, automatic component to empathy, but there's also an on-purpose process. This is called empathic bridging. And empathic bridging is a really important quality in compassion-focused therapy training. Now that means, to use Rogers' term, is that you learn to walk in the shoes of your patient, right? And this means that it's imaginal. It takes effort. And this is Wispy's work in the 1980s, who wrote a really great paper in Journal of Personality and Social Psychology on the differences between sympathy and empathy, and that's what I sort of have been following. That empathy is more effortful. You have to kind of work on it. All right, so here's an example of a training that we did recently. So we're doing work with an OCD hospital with severe OCD patients. So we're working with the staff on empathic bridging. So this patient is admitted, and her arms are completely lacerated and covered in blisters because she's been scrubbing with high level, do you have Domestos here? Disinfectant? Yeah. So she's been scrubbing with disinfectant, and some of her body's in a bad way as well. So the therapy obviously is going to involve exposure work, helping her tolerate the feelings that she has in her body without washing, without scrubbing, and so on and so on. But how are you going to bridge into that emotion? I mean, if you're going to work with her, how are you going to get alongside of her to at least try to feel a little bit about what she's going through? So we talked to our nurses, and they said, oh, I try to imagine what it's like to have arms like this. Well, that's okay, but that's not the emotional bridge. The emotional bridge is to imagine what it is that she feels so that she'd want to do that. And that means that you have to imagine that you are covered in the worst possible shit and vomit you can imagine. And no matter what you do, you can't get it off. Whenever you get into a bed with clean sheets, you're going to contaminate those sheets. You can feel it. It's right in the guts of you. You know that. Okay? So you spend a minute imagining that. Imagine that. Walk into your patient's world, right? Don't just allow it to be automatic, because if you allow it to be automatic, you'll never get there, right? Now, walking into your patient's world can be quite tricky and difficult, but it will help you to begin to be sensitive in your interventions. Okay, so that's important. And again, we do quite a lot of training on what we call empathic bridging. So it's not just bridging into what it is to feel depressed, but bridging into what's going on that might be causing the depression, the fact that somebody's being beaten up at home. It gets more difficult when you're working with abuse cases, because to bridge into that can be a bit tricky. Now, the other thing about empathy, particularly the more intuitive aspects of empathy, is the fact that it can be used for good or for bad. Empathy is neutral, really, and it's the motivation that's the key. Because who is the worst torturer to have, an empathic one or a non-empathic one? It's an empathic torturer. The non-empathic torturer puts the gun to your head and says, tell me your secrets or I blow off your brains. So I got adopted into a drug gang. See? Whereas the empathic one says, tell me your secrets or I blow off the brains of your child. And you will watch. Because that torturer knows that for you, you might be quite happy to lay down your life for your friends. But to watch your child, that's another matter altogether. Now, empathy, of course, is very good for marketing and all kinds of stuff, and for manipulating people. And there are whole divisions within firms that are basically working empathy, trying to work out what will it take to get that person to buy my good, you know. It's not a bad thing or a good thing. It's just recognizing that empathy is a quality, just like the ability to tolerate distress. If you can't tolerate distress, you run away, you're not going to be compassionate. If you get overwhelmed, you can't be compassionate. And of course, the last thing is non-judgment, the ability to be with your experience without judgment. And again, there's a whole thing on that. So there we are then. Those are the engagement. And these are, when you do the training, you just learn how to move around the circle, so you start working out where your patient is. For example, patients can get stuck here. So you might use motivational interviewing, or they might become here. They can't really get into the memory. And the reason they can't get into the memory is because they get overwhelmed. So what you begin to recognize is that these are interactive. So as you begin to do that, and you feel you can tolerate distress better, then you might become more motivated. As you can tolerate distress better, you can stay with distress, so you can begin to understand it more, make sense of things more, what's happening in your mind, why it's happening, okay? As you become more emotionally touched and engaged with, you can do more work to learn how to be distress tolerant. If you're always cutting off here, you never get into any distress, it's very difficult. So the key is then you learning how all of these things are interactive and they fit together. And then finally, we have the alleviation. What is the alleviation? What do we do? Now, the important thing about this is not about avoidance, okay? It can seem like avoidance, but it isn't. So, for example, if you are a person who tends to be an angry person, then when angry things come, you will ruminate on those things. Okay? You'll be the one that really gets stuck with thinking about that shop assistant who really annoyed you. Okay? Because it'll fit with your way of being in the world, right? So the key thing is training you to understand that you can do that if you want to. It's not for me to say you shouldn't do it, but the consequences of doing that is that you're pushing chemicals into your body that are not good. So if you keep ruminating on anger, anger is not good for the heart, for one thing. It's not good for your immune system, and it's not good for your mood. So if you want to, you can begin to pay attention to the people that were helpful to you and train your mind to be paying attention to what is helpful. Reasoning. Now, this is cognitive therapy loves this stuff because compassion is not stupid. Of course compassion uses the evidence. Of course compassion takes perspective. Of course compassion will help you stand back and think things through in a different way. That's, because that's wise, isn't it? It's a sensible thing to do. Feeling, as we've talked about, is very often kindness or desire or heartfelt wish, but not always. Sometimes the first feeling of compassion is anger, okay? But not always. Sometimes it's sadness, okay? It can be great sadness. I remember when I was doing some of my meditation trainings, one of the things that got me caught up in the suffering of life was a meditation we did about the suffering of life. And in this meditation, you imagine yourself standing at the top of a hill, and you see the emergence of life, and you see things living and dying, the diseases and the suffering. You see all the battles. You see what men do to other men and other women, and women do to other women. You see how humans can be cruel. And if you engage in that, I mean, it's just an enormous sadness. If you read the story of the Buddha, the first experience of compassion was sadness. He saw a man beating a donkey and he cries, right? So for me, that would be a movement into compassion. The other thing is behavior. Now, behavior is very, very important because compassionate behaviors mean doing the thing that you need to do in order to deal with your suffering. And that takes courage. 9 times out of 10, you're asking your patients to do courageous things, okay? So if you're agoraphobic, you're learning to go out into the streets and learn how to tolerate your anxiety, right? You're learning this. So your behavior is helping you learn how to tolerate being anxious. Okay? Because many patients will say to me, oh, I'll go out if you take the anxiety away. But of course we know that's not possible. And one of the interesting points about this that will help you here and help you here and help you here is your values, to use an ACT, because ACT sits with compassion focused therapy very well. Steve Hayes gives a wonderful example. He gave an example of a woman who came to him for panic disorder and said, "Can you help me with my panic disorder?" And he said, "Well, why do you want to get over panic?" She said, "Well, because it's not very nice. I don't like panicking." So he said, "Well, that's not good enough, I'm afraid, because one of the things we're going to do in our therapy is going to make you panic, so that you learn how not to be frightened of panic. So if you're frightened of panic, you want it to go away, and we're going to be a therapy that gives you panic." Bit of a tricky thing. So what would you do if you didn't have any panic? What's the one thing in life you really would like to do if you could get rid of your panic? She says, "Well, next year my daughter is graduating, maybe from Stanford." I don't know where she was graduating for, but anyway. And, sorry, this is Palo Alto. Sorry, I got the wrong. Your competitors are Palo Alto. So, and how would it be if you could be there? She said, "Oh, that'd be great, because I wouldn't be there. I can't be there at the moment because I'm too anxious. I know I'd be too anxious to go, but I'd love to go, I'd love to go." So he said, "Okay, that's the thing then. When you're panicking, remember the reason you're panicking, you're going through all this shit, it's because you're going to be there for your daughter, and how wonderful that's going to feel. That's why you want to do it. That's why you're going to suffer, because you're going to get to this position, right?" So the point about it is helping people recognize that encouragement is to hold them and support them such that if you can get to this position, there is a reason for going through this pain. It's not just because you want to get rid of it, all right? It's because you want to transform yourself into another version, a person who can be there for your daughter. That's the version you want to become. And if you learn how to tolerate anxiety, you can become that. So the compassionate behavior is very much about developing the courage to engage in that which we don't want to do. Imagery we're going to be doing after the break. Sensory focusing we're going to be doing after the break, because that is what gets your body going. So then, what do we need in order to feel compassion for this kind of scene? Well, once again, look at this, and then I'm going to ask you to do an emotional bridge, and just pay attention to what happens when you do an emotional bridge. Now, an emotional bridge is that you imagine yourself sitting there. So you actually have to imagine having this body posture. Imagine your hand out like this. Imagine you have a baby across you. And imagine that you're just waiting for somebody to give you some money. Just put yourself in that position and notice what happens in your body. Give you 30 seconds. Okay. Now this is a big group, so some of you won't want to speak out, but if anybody wants to mention what they noticed, what did you notice as you bridged, as you did the imaginal bridge? So you connected to sadness? Sorry? Weakness. Did any of you feel the desperation and hopelessness? Okay. That's the thing, isn't it? The tears are important, but what this person is experiencing. Okay, maybe. So this is what we call emotional bridging, okay? And what would block it? What gets in the way? What stops you from doing this? Fear? Okay, well, again, it's difficult when you have such a big audience, but anything that comes from your threat system will stop it. Okay, so when we did this with the police group, they were full of blocks. Because they worked with people and they get angry, you know. Drug addict. It's a drug addict. And if you ask people to write down in secret, what blocks your compassion? Okay, and then they write it down on a piece of paper and then they put it in a hat or something like that. So you don't know who's written these things. They'll have things like, Why did these people come over here? She's just using her baby. That baby's probably drugged as well. This is disgusting. Blah, 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 blah. Now, why is this important? It's important because there's nothing wrong with the blocks to compassion, no moral about it. It simply is notice it and make a choice. You can block if you want to. It's not for me to say you should or you shouldn't. But do you want to? The thing that you be careful of is that it's automatic for you and you don't even reflect on it. You don't even notice it. It's just an automatic reaction. So you walk on by, immigrant, walk on by, don't even stop and think, hang on a moment. Is that the self I want to be? If I do, then that's okay. But maybe it isn't. And if it isn't, maybe I need to spend a moment just becoming this person and entering their world. Because remember, had I been adopted into wherever this person came from, that could be me. Had I been taken as a 3-day-old baby, that could be me. Okay, so the key thing then is understanding then that compassion is a mentality that organizes your mind. Okay, this is key to the sync of the thing. It organizes your mind. So by stimulating compassion motives, compassionate desires, we are on a trip to becoming a particular kind of self. Okay, and we make the choice to become the compassionate self because we can see the benefits of it. It's not just about it being a moral thing. It's because you can begin to make contact with this element of yourself that you saw from that 18-month-old baby. There is an element in yourself that wants to be caring. There's also an element of yourself that's easily threatened and wants to be aggressive or wants to be competitive. These are all possible selves within you, and we'll be doing this afternoon. But we begin to make a choice. Actually, I think probably I'd like to be this one. So remember then, compassion is flow. Okay, so there's the compassion that you feel from other people being compassionate to you. There's the compassionate that you have for other people, and this self-compassion. These are all exercises that we're going to be doing, and that gives you the rise to that. And just to say that compassion, of course, has been a focus for thousands of years. The Buddha has always argued that the road to happiness is compassion, but happiness shouldn't be the focus. It's not your personal happiness that's the focus, but you will become happier if you take an interest in others. We also know from evolution that our brains are highly sensitive to kindness. From the day that you're born to the day that you die, the kindness of other people is going to make a huge difference to your life. You grow up in a world of basic kindness around you, and your life is going to be a hell of a lot better. Your brain is going to be a lot better. Your immune system is going to be a lot better than if you grew up in a world of indifference or even unkindness. The neuroscience is also very clear. There are specific areas of your brain that respond to kindness. And we know that a history of affiliation and kindness affects a whole lot of stuff. So being cared for affects your genes. It affects your stress reactivity. It has an impact on your immune function. It affects your frontal cortex, illness and recovery, core values, self-identities. On and on and on and on we go. The psychology of caring, the psychology of kindness is powerful, powerful stuff. And we as psychologists, right, have ignored this in our therapy for far too long. The question is how do you build this into therapy? That's the issue, particularly that your brain is a social signal process. So it's all very well doing cognitive challenges and all of that. That's fine, and I'm all in favor of it, but that's only part of the story. And so the core of our story really is this, okay? That we are at our most flourishing in terms of how our frontal cortex is working, our immune system is working, our stress system is working, our cardiovascular system is working, and our emotions and our sense of peacefulness. This is data. This is not, I'm not making this up. This is absolutely out there. When we experience and feel we are cared about, wanted, and valued, even at the point of death, if you feel that you are cared about, you are loved, then your death is going to be easier than if you feel nobody cares about you. And when we are ourselves caring, helping, and valuing, in contrast to hating, rejecting, criticizing. You look at what happens in your brain and your blood system and your blood pressure when you become angry or critical of other people, you see it there. So this is fundamental basic science of the last 10, 20 years. That's when you're at your best. Now that doesn't mean, this is different from the Buddhists, that doesn't mean that you are basically good. Okay? It means that you have this capacity within you that you can grow like a seed. There are other seeds in you as well, and they're just as basic. Cruelty is there as well. And if you were interested in the Roman history, you would know that there are whole cultures that reveled in cruelty for various reasons. So there's all kinds of potentials within us, you know. It's not just one, but there is this one, and this one. If you cultivate this one, then it turns out that you function in a fantastic way. So CFT reaches for the self that wants to be wanted, belong. And so when you're working with all the anger and the rage and the terror and all the crap, you're always seeing underneath, somewhere underneath is that person who always came into this world that wanted to be loved, that wanted to be valued, that wanted to be wanted, and wanted to be caring themselves. Underneath, somewhere underneath there. That's what you're always reaching for. Despite all the rage and the hatred underneath, because that is what will bring harmony to the self. So there we are, social mentality. There we are, this is what we're about. And there we are. So the only thing I would mention to you, which I'm going to do very quickly after the break, before the because we're about time now, before the exercises, is the things that are going to get into the way of your training. But I'll do that within 10 minutes or so that we can get into the exercises. So, and I should be wandering around. If there are any questions, please feel free to ask me. I know this is a very rushed workshop, but Yodam said you must do this, you must do this. And I'm a very obedient kind of person. I do what I'm told. So I hope we've given you a good flavor, and I apologize for not allowing questions. There was a lot to get through. And then after the break, we'll get you into doing the body focusing exercises. So thank you.